In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew a baby doll dress. I also want to show you how changing the fabric, the notions, and the volume of the pattern can really change the look of the dress. So for this project, I'm going to show you two different types of fabric, different types of notions, so elastic, lace, and show different ways of using these materials, thread. You're going to need some scissors, pins, ruler or measuring tape, and the pattern that we made in the last video. If you want a more in-depth explanation of how to make the pattern and how to put the dress together, I would check the other video out first. First, we're going to play with the volume of the pattern. So I'm going to add a little more volume into the top, which in turn will create more gathering. I'm going to do this with my lighter fabric because it's a little bit more see-through and the gathering will help with that. As for the bottom of the dress, one of them I'm just going to create more of an A-line shape, and on the other one I'm going to create more gathering and more of an A-line shape, and you can see the difference on the look of the two dresses. Starting with the A-line shape, I'm just adding more volume or space between the panels at the bottom of the dress. And this will just create more of a flare at the bottom of the dress without creating more gathering at the top. And you can do this with a lot of existing patterns to really change the look of the garment. So I've cut my two pieces of the skirt for the black dress. And then for the lighter fabric, I'm creating space on the top and the bottom of the panels, keeping that curved shape. This will create more of an extreme A-line as well as more gathering at the top. And again, I'm cutting two of these pieces. For the black dress, I'm going to cut it exactly the same as we did in the last video, but for the lighter fabric, I'm going to cut a center line down the bust piece and add 10 centimeters to create more volume and more gathering in the front. And then I'm going to sew my side seams and my shoulder seams either right sides together or with a French seam, whichever you prefer. You're going to also sew the side seams of your skirt part as well. I used a French seam because it always creates a cleaner look. Then I'm going to sew a basting stitch along the bottom of the bust piece and the top of the skirt piece. And a basting stitch is just the largest stitch on your machine with no back stitch. And then pulling the loose thread of that stitch is how I create gathering. I'm not going to gather it until it fits. I'm just going to create a little bit of gathering because the rest is going to be done with a drawstring. And then I'm just pinning those two pieces right sides together, and I'm going to sew it with a straight stitch and then go over it again and lock in my loose threads with a zigzag stitch. Now this is where the detailing is going to come in and the two dresses are going to become unique. We're going to start by creating a channel by folding that fabric over, pinning in the seam and catching the fabric on the back. So as you can see, the fabric's being caught on the back by the pin, which is what's going to create the channel. Before we sew the channel down, we're going to sew two buttonholes side by side at the front of the dress, large enough that our ribbon's going to fit through. And then you can go ahead and sew along where you pinned. You can either sew in the seam or right beside the seam. I like the look of a little bit of a top stitch, so I sewed beside the seam. Then we're going to do the second stitch of the channel, making sure that we're leaving enough room that we can insert our ribbon. To insert the ribbon, I like to attach the ribbon to a sewing machine needle with a piece of thread, and then with the dull side of the needle, push it through the channel that we created, through the buttonhole. This step can be very tedious. You just want to make sure you take it slow and you don't pull it too hard that the thread breaks. We're ready to move on to the neckline, where I'm going to do a basting stitch along the front and the back. And then I'm going to pull the loose threads, creating gathers until I like the way it fits. The detail I'm going to use along the neckline is a picot bias binding, and I'm going to pin this along the entire front and back of the neckline. This is an example of an added detail that can really create a unique look to your dress. And once you're done pinning, you're going to sew along where you pinned. I've also added a little bow on the front that I'm going to hand stitch later. Next, we're going to move on to the sleeves, where I'm going to use an elastic, again with a picot edge, to create the finish. I measured where the sleeve's going to hit, which is the top of my arm, and then I cut the elastic in that length. And then I'm going to place the right side of the elastic on the right side of the fabric with the detail facing in. And then I'm going to pin it all along the edge of the sleeve. There should be more fabric than there is elastic, which is why we're going to stretch it as we sew. And then we're going to sew this, again pulling the elastic with a zigzag stitch to allow for stretch. Then I'm going to trim away any fabric that's poking out from beneath the elastic. And then finally, I'm going to fold that elastic over and go over it again with a zigzag stitch. This is a super easy and one of my favorite ways to finish off sleeves. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other side of the dress. After trying the dress on, I realized it was a little loose on the top and gaped a bit, so here's a technique you can use if yours is doing the same. On the inside of the dress, I'm inserting the same elastic that I used for the sleeves, and this is going to create a more cinched look for the neckline. So again, pulling it as I sew, and it creates just more ruching around the neck. Next, I'm going to hand sew my bow. You could use your machine, but for bows, I always prefer to use a hand stitch. Finally, we're going to move on to the hem. And for this, I'm again going to use the picot bias binding. For the hem, I found it easier to sew it on in 2 steps, so I'm going to first attach it and then sew it with a top stitch. So I'm just going to tuck in the raw edge and then sew again with the top stitch. And then I did a vertical zigzag stitch along where the 2 pieces overlapped. I'm now going to show a couple different techniques on the other version of the dress. Even by just changing the ribbon, you can really change the look of the dress. For this neckline, I'm going to use a bias strip and lace trimming to finish the edge. We're going to start by putting 2 buttonholes on the inside of both of our straps horizontally. And we want these buttonholes large enough that we're going to be able to insert our ribbon. Now we're ready to work on the neckline. We're going to place the lace on the right side of the fabric with the detail facing in and our bias strip on top of that. Again, all on the right side of the fabric. And then we're going to sew this around the entire neckline. Then we're going to iron out what we just sewed. My strip is a little too big for the ribbon that I'll be using, so I'm going to trim it down so that it's 1 centimeter wider than the ribbon. And then I'm going to fold that 1 centimeter over and iron that as well. And then finally fold that over once more, iron and pin it down. And then I'm going to sew along where I pinned, making sure that the space between the seam that I'm creating and the edge of the fabric is wide enough to insert my ribbon. I can then open up my buttonholes, and then with a safety pin, I'm going to insert my ribbon. I'm going to insert 1 strand of ribbon for the front and 1 for the back, and this allows me to tie 2 bows on the shoulders. You also have the option to move the placement of the buttonholes, which would then allow you to have the bows on different places on the neckline. So you could, for example, have them in the front and the back as well. For the sleeve, I'm going to do the same elastic technique that I did for the beige dress. And then finally, moving on to the hem, I'm just going to fold the fabric over twice and then attach the piece of ribbon. So again, just ironing that down once, folding it over again, and then I'm going to go over that with a seam and then attach the ribbon in another step. The main thing I wanted to show you guys with this video is that by changing your fabric, your notions, and your volume, you can really change the look and the vibe of a basic pattern. And this can be with patterns that you make or patterns that you buy, and it's really important when you start your sewing journey to learn about different fabrics and to see how they fall and to see how they gather and how much you can actually change the look of what you're trying to make by just changing the fabric, the volume, and the notions. And you're all done! Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.